Good afternoon again, everyone. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce to you this afternoon Congressman Khanna. Congressman Khanna represents California's 17th Congressional District. It's located in the heart of Silicon Valley. He's serving his first term in Congress. Congressman Khanna sits on the House Budget and Armed Services Committees, and he is a vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Representative Khanna's commitment to public service was inspired by his grandfather, who was active in Gandhi's independence movement, a man who spent several years in jail for promoting human rights. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. He wrote the book Entrepreneurial Nation: Why Manufacturing is Still Key to America's Future, and he worked as a lawyer specializing in intellectual property law. Please join me in welcoming the rising star, Representative Khanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelton, and I am such a fan of your work and your voice in helping shape economic thinking for our country, for our party. I'm hopeful more people will listen to you as they have begun to listen to you. And it's a real honor to be addressing all of you with such a distinguished group of speakers, from Mehdi Hasan, who you just heard, to Senator Sanders later in the day. I want to offer some thoughts from my perspective and then really open it up more for a conversation and your ideas. One of the challenging things as we frame the economic debate currently is the argument goes something like this. Donald Trump and the Republicans will say, we believe we're going to have 3.5% economic growth or 4% economic growth. We will say, no, we're only going to get 2.2% economic growth. And then they will say, you don't believe in the greatness of the American people. And my question when I got there is, is this really the ground that we want to be arguing on? Or could there be another way of framing the question? I don't want to get in trouble with colleagues, and I respect all of them, but one of the people there was saying, well, we got to really go after Trump's plan because it's not revenue neutral. Now, forget the economic theories and differences. There's not a single person in my district who speaks about revenue neutrality. Try talking to people and saying, the problem with Donald Trump's plan is it's not revenue neutral. And see how many people are going to be inspired to say, gosh, we got to really stop that plan because it's not revenue neutral. We're so caught up in Washington speak that we have let the Republicans frame an argument, what they call supply-side economics, of saying we're going to have these massive tax cuts, it's going to unleash the potential of the American economy, that's going to get 4% growth. And we look like the people saying, no, 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 no. No, the economy can't grow that much. No, this is just going to be terrible for the numbers. And they look like they're projecting optimism. Of course, the facts are not on their side. We know that it would make far more sense, but we know what happens when you give corporations these massive tax cuts. I mean, you don't have to be an economist of Stephanie Kelton's distinguished career or even a lecturer at Stanford to understand the basic facts. I mean, it's common sense. We've seen it over the last 20 years. Corporations, they get the tax cuts, and they invest them in stock buybacks. That's what happens. And the people who get the most enriched from them are corporate executives who are compensated in stocks. And I guess if your view was that corporate profits in this country weren't high enough, or that corporate executive pay wasn't sufficient, or that we needed more money going to the investor class, then maybe you'd be for the Republican proposal. Because that's really at the core of their worldview. I I mean, if you really sit down, and I come from Silicon Valley, and you ask people like Peter Thiel or others, what do you believe? Why do you believe this is going to lead to job creation? And if they were honest with you, they actually believe in the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. They believe that money is better in the hands of the Peter Thiels of the world to go invest in innovation and startups than to have the capital diffuse. That's literally their worldview. That's how they justify. They can't say that publicly. But that's how they justify this theory that we're going to just cut taxes and this is going to lead to growth. It's sort of the great man theory of economics, and some of them have explicitly cited Ayn Rand in their sense that, we give the money to the folks who really know what they're doing from their perspective. And then they sell this as this is going to raise wages. Of course, it's one of the most indirect arguments that we're going to, if you want to raise wages, just raise wages, as opposed to trying to cut corporate taxes with this theory that somehow that's going to lead to wages. So Sherrod Brown and I had the idea, this radical idea, that maybe if we want to raise wages that have stagnated, we should just raise wages by expanding the earned income tax credit. And you could actually expand the earned income tax credit dramatically to compensate for the stagnation of wages of the last 30 years. It would be about $1.4 trillion. And you would get about $10,000 back to people making $75,000 or less. It still wouldn't cost as much as the Trump tax cut. Now, we have 50-some House sponsors on this bill. Some of the senators are concerned about the price tag. And, but the question is this. And Sherrod Brown and I made this argument to our leadership. If we're going to argue in the framework of revenue neutrality, it's fine. Maybe it will be, we shouldn't say anything and we shouldn't offer an idea like let's give wage raises to working families and the middle class. And then the theory is just be anti-Trump. Just say he's exploding the deficit. I don't think that that's good enough. I think we have to offer a positive vision on our side. I think we have to say we believe America can get to 3 or 4% economic growth. We just don't believe it's the Peter Thiels or the investor class that's going to get us there. We believe it's ordinary Americans, factory workers, teachers, clerks, nurses, people who live in communities, small businesses. We believe they are the ones, investing in them is what's going to lead to the economic growth. But first, this is just factually the case because almost any economist will tell you the reason we haven't had as much economic growth is a consumer demand issue. It's not an issue of corporations not having enough money. They're not. You talk to the tech CEOs or some of the CEOs in my district, they're going to tell you what will make them create more jobs is that more people buy their products. It's not that they are going to suddenly create more jobs if they have more money in their bank account. If they have more money in their bank account, they're going to purchase stocks or they're going to issue larger dividends. But why would they expand making more iPhones and more people aren't buying iPhones? So it is common sense that if we really wanted to grow the economy, create more jobs, what we would do is make sure people had more money to spend. And guess what? When you give someone money who's making $75,000 or $85,000 or $50,000, they're probably likely to spend it in the United States. They're likely to buy things in their communities. They're likely to buy products, cars, televisions, phones, food. My wife, Amazon packages, it's that's what they buy. Medical care. And if you give it to the Peter Thiels or the investor class, chances are they're not going to even be investing some of that in the United States. They may not spend it. They may put it in any place in the world. So what I believe the Democratic Party needs to do is offer an alternative vision, not just of fairness, but of economic growth. To say they believe that America's economic future is in the hands of the few elite. We believe that the way to build America's economy, to build our economic growth, is by investing in the working class and the middle class. That's not just the right thing to do in a period of globalization and automation where we've had unprecedented concentration of wealth. It's also the smart thing to do economically. And we can worry about the math of the deficits later. We should model in economic growth into our projections. The Republicans model this in. I once asked someone at the Budget Committee, I said, how does it work? So if Trump says that there's going to be 4% growth, and let's say there's 2.8% growth, then next year, does he have to take a 2.8% growth assumption? I said, no. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he'll come up with a new theory that there's 3% growth. So why don't we make our case of what we think it's going to take to grow the economy? Sherrod Brown and I think part of it is the expansion earned income tax credit, which we could talk about very simply, a pay raise of 20% for every American making under $75,000. You're working harder, making less. That's the average person's experience. They're doing the same job often, or their hours have been reduced. They're making less money. Their costs are going up, and they're desperate for a pay raise. Well, we're going to give you a pay raise. How many people have heard of the the slogan, this better deal? You know, I said to the leadership, I think it's great. We're for more jobs and more wages. How are we going to do it? We can't just say we're for more jobs and more wages. We got to have a plan. You know, what's the plan to get more jobs and more wages? I disagreed with everything Donald Trump said in the campaign. 99% of what he said. I mean, I'm sure there's something he may have said by random chance that we can all agree on. But one of the things he had a plan. He had a plan that we all disagreed with that meant, you know, we're going to stop immigrants, we're going to build a wall, we're going to engage in these trade wars, and this is how I'm going to bring you your jobs. We need to have a specific plan. How are we going to raise wages and raise jobs? It's not enough to just say it. So the expansion of the earned income tax credit is one concrete way to do it. But we can do more. You could have debt-free college. You could have Medicare for all. You still wouldn't get to the size of the Trump tax cut. In a way, he's made it possible to talk about everything we want to talk about because he's so expanded the conversation in what's acceptable in terms of the trillions. What we ought to do is we ought to put forward our agenda. Here is what we want to do. We want a child care tax credit. We want an earned income tax credit. We want a debt-free college. We want apprenticeship spending on massive apprenticeships across the country. We want to move to Medicare for all. And by the way, that's going to unleash the potential of ordinary, hardworking Americans across this country. And here's the choice. Do you believe we're going to get to 4% economic growth by making the same bet on Wall Street and the investor class? Or do you believe we're going to get to 4% economic growth by making a bet on the working class and the middle class? I think the challenge for us is to offer that economic vision as progressives, to not simply poke holes in Trump's plan. And that is really why I was so honored to come to this conference to share this perspective and to open it up for your thoughts. The one other area that I have been working on is to try to get a sense of economic aspiration in thinking in Silicon Valley about parts of the country that have been left out. I supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, but after Secretary Clinton won, I was a very strong supporter of hers. And I told John Podesta, I said, I was just a candidate back then, but I said, instead of having Secretary Clinton come for the 15th time to my district, why don't we have some of these tech leaders go to other parts of the country and announce jobs and announce what they're doing in economic creation in areas in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, to try to create economic opportunity in some of these places which have been left out. I saw a study that of the 3,000 or so counties in the United States, 2,000 of them had, over the last decade, lost a net of 150,000 small businesses and entrepreneurs. And 1,000 of them, like Santa Clara County, where I live, had created about 300,000 new jobs and businesses. Think about that. We've got an extraordinarily geographically divided country where 2/3 of the country in geographies are not participating in the new economy or in the economic success that many feel is coming from globalization or innovation. And of course they would be frustrated. And so Trump came along and said, I'm going to bring you back. Remember the days where you were employed and you had pride in what you did. And he sold a false vision, but he gave them a vision. I had my nephew. He's in Cleveland, and he's 10 years old. My wife's nephew, now 12. He was 10 back when he came to visit us in the Valley. He wanted to play for the NFL, and he said one Indian American has ever done that. Your odds aren't that great. But he came out to the Valley, and we took him to see an A's game and a Dell concert. But he wanted to tour some of these tech companies. And I realized then the power of imagination and the sense of wanting to be part of the future and wanting to have that economic possibility. Think about how many kids in this country grow up dreaming about playing in the NFL. How many grow up dreaming about playing in the NBA? How many get to do it? 2,000 in the NFL, 700 in the NBA, but they're all bought in. They're all bought in to the system. We've got to create economic hope, economic opportunity, a path to the future in communities that don't feel a connection to technology and the new economy. And that's a task not just for those of us in Congress. It's a task for business leaders. It's a task for civic leaders on how we're going to create that kind of economic opportunity across this country. So in conclusion, I guess my view is we need a vision that's going to give folks hope of economic growth, a real policy that's going to convince them that they're going to have higher wages, and that's going to convince them that their kids can be part of the new economy. And if we offer that vision, that's how I think we contrast with what Trump's selling, instead of simply poking holes in what he is offering. Those are my thoughts, and now I'll open it up to some thoughts and questions. Yes, sir.
My name is Pat Malloy. I think it's the book of Proverbs, without a vision, the people will perish. So I agree with you. We need a vision. I'm a friend of Sherrod Brown's. I have his pin on. Let me just give you my thought. I was general counsel of the Senate Banking Committee when we moved from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, which I think is an enormous problem because corporations used to think they had a responsibility to their workers, their communities, their shareholders, their country, and everything else. Now their sole responsibility, they think, is to increase shareholder value, and they've tied their own compensation to their ability to increase shareholder value, and that's why CEO compensation has mushroomed. Now, here's what I saw. I was on the China Commission for 10 years as a commissioner, Sherrod Brown helped me be on there. Other countries saw what was going on and offered incentives for our companies to outsource production jobs and technology to them. And we had no counter strategy as to what was going on here. So we outsourced jobs and production, created enormous current account deficits for ourselves, and we have no strategy, and people don't even talk about this. Now, it seems to me we're talking about tax reform. Apple does all this production in China. Why don't we give Apple a very low tax rate if they produce in the United States and a very high tax rate if you produce abroad? That you've got to re-incentivize the behavior of these corporations. So I offer that for you to comment on, and also maybe even think about how we can push this within our party.
Well, I appreciate that. I personally believe we need to end corporate tax deferral, which means right now, companies are overseas and they're earning money and they're not paying tax. And people say, well, won't these companies move? They're not going to move. I mean, Apple's not going to relocate the spaceship they've built in my district if we start taxing their profits overseas. And I'm open to giving tax credits if they're actually going to create employment or increase manufacturing, and particularly in areas of this country that are economically depressed or that haven't had economic growth. But the current plan, which would just allow them to repatriate this stuff, the money, at 5%, 7%, where we know what they're going to do with it, not because of theory, because we have it a case from 2004. They're going to put this money back into stock buybacks to artificially inflate their stock prices. They're going to pay out more dividends, and we're not going to get any revenue. We could collect $750 billion of tax revenue if we taxed all the overseas profits at the normal rate. And that would pay for Bernie Sanders' debt-free college bill. I mean, you could send everyone in this country making under $125,000 to college for free by doing that. And so I agree with you that I think we need, everyone's for tax reform. The question is what type of reform. My view is if you tax that money offshore and you incentivize actual hiring or increasing in production in communities, then that would get to what you're saying. And this bill, I think, does exactly the opposite. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, two very brief comments. First, I thought this was one of the best kind of progressive economic platforms I've heard, so keep it up.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The other one's off the current point, but I wanted to thank you very much for your leadership in Congress on trying to stop the U.S. support for Saudi's war in Yemen, because we need more people to do that, and I really appreciate the work that you've done on it.
Well, I appreciate that very much. We have a debate finally today at 5 o'clock, and I'll tell you, the details of that. We offered a resolution to stop the refueling of Saudi planes and assistance of the Saudis in targeting in Yemen with the civilian bombing. There are almost 900,000 Yemenis that face cholera, almost 7 million that are at risk of famine. It's probably the greatest humanitarian catastrophe right now in the world, according to Human Rights Watch and many of the groups that have looked at this. And we have absolutely no stake in aiding the Saudis in a proxy war with Iran in their fight against the Houthis in Yemen. At least we should make sure that they allow humanitarian assistance. They've blocked the ports. They've blocked the airports. Now, we didn't get a vote on the War Powers Resolution Act, which would have been binding, because the argument was made that our providing refueling to the Saudis does not trigger the War Powers Act. I don't know how many people remember or have read history to know the origins of the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act passed over Richard Nixon's veto to prevent us from getting into Vietnam was intended precisely to stop military conflict even when we didn't have ground troops. It says it is triggered if we are, quote, coordinating or participating with a foreign government in any foreign conflict. So on the face of the statute, it should apply. But, we're not in the majority. We weren't going to get them to agree to that, so they finally allowed us to agree to a resolution that at least acknowledges that we are engaged in refueling and in targeting, and acknowledges that this is not authorized under the War Powers, the Authorization of Force of 2001. And the reason I think this matters so much beyond the humanitarian stakes in Yemen is the cycle of violence that we have perpetuated by our interventionist posture in North Africa and the Middle East. And the Yemenis are blaming a young generation is holding us partially responsible for the killings. Why do we want that? Why do we want a generation of people who most Americans don't know were there? Why do we want them growing up blaming the United States? And we have to start to rethink whether this interventionism has made us more safe and whether it's in our national security. And the good news is that there are now a number of Republicans also who feel very much the same way. And for the first time today at 5 o'clock, anyone a C-SPAN junkie will be debating that on the floor of the House.
Where would you like to go? You had your hand up for a long time. I'm not an economist, but what I don't understand is why they get to evoke Reagan trickle-down and it's okay, but we can't look back to FDR and some of the proud things that we've accomplished in the past. We know that some of those theories worked, and what you're talking about in terms of making sure that common people have money to spend has been accepted since Henry Ford. I don't understand why it's hard to imagine that might work.
I think it's a great point. And FDR had this theory of democratic experimentalism. He tried different things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. But on the aggregate, it worked. And we're so afraid of now having government make any mistake. Not every program, if where I came from, if Silicon Valley operated that way, that everyone was afraid of making a mistake, you'd never have innovation. Well, we need that kind of innovative spirit in government. We shouldn't be so afraid that every program has to be 100%. We need to try different things to get it to work, put money in the hands of people who are going to spend it. I agree with you. It was our history for the longest time. But the Reagan Revolution changed the terms of the debate. And I think that when we argue from the framework of deficit spending and when we argue from the framework of revenue neutrality, we're arguing on the Republicans' terms. And ironically, they're not even arguing that anymore. They're saying 4% growth. That's what and so we're the ones saying, no, you're not being, you're not being responsible. And forget the substance, where I fundamentally actually agree with the substance of the economics, that having people spend more money is going to lead to more economic growth. But it's just a horrible political message. Who is the person going to vote for? The person saying, yes, we can grow 4% and we're going to give tax cuts and grow the economy? Or the party saying, no, we can't. We can only do it 2.2% and we're not revenue neutral. In this country, we vote for optimism. So we ought to have an optimistic economic message. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Okay. The issue about the bill that you're working on for the earned income.
Yes.
That's great, except that, as I know, having been one of those people years ago with kids, that there's only certain people eligible for that. So I have a couple of questions as to why progressives aren't being innovative and pushing forward with the potentials for the federal jobs guarantee, for a real living wage, a federal living wage, and why we don't just lower the taxes on people earning less than $100,000, regardless of whether they have children or not.
Well, it's a very thoughtful question. If I were to redesign the entire tax code, I would have a separate child care tax credit and delink the earned income tax credit from kids. I think that the combination of that has not been good economic policy. And you could have a massive expansion of a child care tax credit. Rosa DeLauro has taken a step towards that direction in her bill. Justin Trudeau in Canada proposed a huge expansion that is probably the biggest thing you could do to prevent poverty, is to provide child care tax credit regardless of, and delink that from the earned income tax credit. And then you could have the earned income tax credit expanded without that. And I think that would be probably the best framework. In terms of lowering the tax, I'm also for lowering the tax on folks making up to, we'd have to $75,000, $80,000, $100,000. So I don't think it's a question of disagreement as much as the practical. We only have one senator right now, Sherrod Brown, on the bill, and 50 House members, and a bill that would completely rewrite the earned income tax credit, I think, would be even a harder lift in getting people on board. So I think it was more a pragmatic, let's keep within the existing framework and see how much we can expand it within that. But and we do expand dramatically the tax credit for childless workers, because they were getting almost nothing under the current plan. But I agree with you that that's, there could be someone even more bold proposing something that's even that even goes further, and that would probably look, in my view, as a combination, as you put it, expansion of the child tax credit, expansion of earned income tax credit delinked to kids, and maybe some making sure people aren't paying federal tax up to a certain income level.
So regarding it passing a real federal living wage and a proposal for a federal jobs guarantee.
I'm for the federal living wage. It depends. Would that be $15 or what would at what? Yeah, I think that's actually necessary if you couple it with the earned income tax credit, because I think the earned income tax credit, otherwise the employer could gain a lot of the benefit if it's not coupled with an increase in the minimum wage to a livable wage. So in my view, you have to do both, because if you just provide the tax credit and you don't require a raise in the wages, then the employer will end up just keeping the wage, lowering the wage, and taking the benefit. On the jobs guarantee, I'm for strong. I don't know whether I would call it a guarantee politically. I'm open to it, but probably I would frame it differently. I'd say let's have massive infrastructure spending. Let's have massive spending. We have a $2 trillion in the progressive budget proposal that would lead to, in my view, job creation. I think that would be a good start. I think that would still mean that people have to work towards, you want to, in my view, still reward work. But I'm open to how we frame it. But in terms of having a robust policy of federal spending that's going to create jobs, that I strongly support. Yes.
Yeah. First of all, let me echo what Bill Hartung said. I think this is an extremely promising articulation of a progressive program. I wanted to come back to the point you made about the regional divisions in the country, because it seems to me that what Donald Trump did in the campaign was to appeal very effectively to particular areas which had traditionally voted Democratic but which were feeling left out of the economic development. And this is how he broke the blue wall, right, so to speak. Now what is happening, first of all, the promises that he made to those people, which were based on a program of trade protection, are manifestly not going to be kept. There is not going to be an industrial revival in Michigan, because if there were, it would start voting Democratic again. So it's pretty obvious that that's not going to happen. And at the same time, he shifted to a tax program which is not only going to concentrate wealth, but concentrate it where it already exists, which is to say, not in those areas either. So it just seems to me that there has opened up a possibility, a real opportunity for a policy that would deliver something effectively to the regions that have been left out, that would transform the climate for a progressive economic policy in the country. And we ought to be thinking about that, maybe somewhat in contrast to the strategy of simply raising the growth rate. So what the New Deal did in a time before there was actually a growth rate to measure was to put a massive investment in the most depressed region, which was the South. And that, of course, locked in a pattern of a coalition in American politics that lasted for 40 years. So I just throw that out to you as,
I think you're absolutely
as a thought
right.
building on yours.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And you're probably and I think you are right. First of all, that's not just looking at the aggregate data. I think that was the mistake many of us made. I mean, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. I didn't think Donald Trump was going to win. And you looked at all the data, and it looked like there was this huge job recovery. The stock market was relatively doing well. The GDP was doing well. But we didn't go and look at the underlying data and see, well, that masked huge geographical inequality. And I think I think Sanders spoke to that. It's not just that his that's what he was fighting for his whole life. It was that his message particularly resonated in places which were not facing better prospects and which the data had masked. And there was a complacency that the prosperity was being shared where it wasn't being shared. Now, there are a whole host of reasons, but I think an investment in communities that have been left behind of prosperity, whether that's investment in apprenticeships, whether it's investment in putting places, science and technology institutes there, whether it's investment in more infrastructure there, whether it's providing tax credits for tied to investment there. I do think that we have to look at these regional zones of how we can create economic opportunity in places left behind, and we should be geographically deliberate about it in rural communities, in minority communities that have been left behind, and I tell this to people in my district. I said, you've been the beneficiaries of a lot of change, whether. We can argue whether the Stiglitz view is right or wrong about whether they're rent seekers or whether they're productive economic contributors. But even if you give them that they're productive economic contributors, they've been lucky to have learned computers at the age of 2 and to be part of this new transformation. And so that they have, in my view, an obligation to make sure everyone benefits from this, and a particular obligation to help communities that have been left out. And I think the party should, I think you and others should help put together a clear plan for what it would look like in these communities. Okay. Good. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.